Welcome to Tabletop Tommies, episode 10. I'm Jonny.
And I'm Phil.
And in a break from our recent episodes where we've been doing the armies on parade of all the various nations available to play in bolt action, today we will be discussing armoured platoons in bolt action, how to use them and where to find them. The main source we're going to be looking at today is the Tank Wars book, and we will be touching on the tank aces you'll find in the book. But first, over to the news with Phil.
Thank you, Jonny. So, welcome to the first edition of Tabletop Tommies News. The headlines this week. Firstly, we have a brand new website on its way, which you can find at tabletoptommies.com. You can visit it to find links to all your favourite places where you can stream the podcast, as well as information about events we are organising and other updates about the podcast. Also coming soon, we have just recently launched our range of merchandise. We started with a range of t-shirts, which are available in two varieties, and these are 100% organic cotton and remilled cotton. We were very careful when looking for suppliers to ensure they were both sustainable and responsible in their manufacturing processes. Our t-shirts are made with 100% renewable electricity, and at the end of the t-shirt's life, you can return it to the manufacturer to have the fabric recycled. All money raised from sales will be reinvested into the podcast to allow us to continue bringing out episodes every week. So do please consider buying a t-shirt from tabletoptommies.com. Finally, we're delighted to say that tickets are selling nicely for the English Open. However, as predicted by the old major Mark Vance, Allied tickets are selling better than Axis tickets. So we're making a call to arms for all Axis players to please join us at the English Open. Additionally, if you are dead set on playing Allies at the English Open, we would strongly recommend buying your tickets soon to avoid disappointment. That's all the news for today. Back to you, Jonny, in the studio.
Thank you very much, Phil. Moving into our regularly scheduled programming, we're talking through the Tank Wars book specifically to start with. First of all, I think the best place to start is to talk about the armoured selector you might find in there that allows you to run a tank platoon. Phil, how does the armoured selector differ from the generic selector you find in the main rulebook?
So, Jonny, it follows a similar pattern in the sense that there are some compulsory units and then a number of optional units with some restrictions placed upon those optional units. Mm-hmm. However, the main difference is in the nature of those compulsory units. So, for an armoured platoon selector, you must choose one command vehicle. And that can be a tank destroyer, assault gun, self-propelled artillery, anti-aircraft vehicle, or an armoured car.
So anything really then?
Basically anything that's armoured, yeah.
Yep.
So a command vehicle, it's simply any of those vehicles in the list I've just read, which has the command vehicle special rule, or it's been given this special rule from its entries options. Now, if no such vehicle is available to the player, any one of the vehicles can be given the command vehicle special rule for an additional 25 points, even if its entry does not normally allow this option. So essentially what we're saying is rather than buying an officer, mm-hmm. you have to buy a command vehicle. And that command vehicle will either have the special rule of command vehicle in its description, or if it doesn't, you need to pay an additional 25 points to give it the command vehicle special rule.
So just jumping in there, the command vehicle special rule in traditional war game style isn't in the Tank Wars book. It's actually found in the main rule book. So it's in the special rules for vehicles, and what it does is it adds a morale bonus of +1 to itself and any other friendly armoured vehicles within 12 inches, but no snap to like you'd normally get with an officer. Yeah. So the key point there that I think I've misplayed previously is it's only armoured vehicles. So if you've got something like a recce Jeep, that's not armoured, it's not going to benefit from that morale bonus, I believe.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
So what type of vehicles have the command vehicle special rule?
Not many. To be honest, Jonny, most armoured vehicles don't have the command vehicle special rule. There are a limited number that allow it either as a free or a paid-for upgrade. But what you generally see with an armoured platoon is that most people will take whatever tank they want and just pay that additional 25 points to make it a command vehicle.
So I've taken my command vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
What else do I have to have before I can choose from the options, Phil?
Okay, so your other compulsory units are 2 vehicles, which again can be a tank destroyer, an assault gun, a self-propelled artillery, anti-aircraft vehicle, or armoured car. So if you think about a normal reinforced platoon from the main rulebook, your compulsory units there is an officer and 2 infantry squads. For an armoured platoon, it is a armoured vehicle as a command vehicle, and then 2 vehicles as your compulsory units.
Perfect. And then your options?
So your options are you can take 0 to 2 vehicles from the above, so tank destroyer, assault gun, self-propelled artillery, anti-aircraft vehicle, and armoured car. So you can have a maximum of 5 vehicles from the armoured car or tank options. 0 to 3 infantry squads, 0 to 1 lieutenant, 0 to 1 captain or major, 0 to 1 medic. Now, Tank Wars was written before chaplains were introduced, but I imagine that chaplains would also be 0 to 1, but they're not specified.
No one's going to begrudge you a chaplain, I think.
No. 0 to 1 forward observer, 0 to 1 machine gun team, 0 to 1 mortar team, 0 to 1 sniper team, 0 to 1 flamethrower team, 0 to 1 anti-tank team, and 0 to 1 artillery units. So essentially, it's pretty much the same structure as a generic reinforced platoon that you find in the main rulebook. However, your compulsory units is a command vehicle and 2 vehicles, rather than your compulsory officer and 2 infantry units.
And then there's one other requirement, isn't there?
There is. So for any infantry or artillery that you take in your platoon, you have to have enough transport vehicles and or tows for every single man in those units or the artillery to be mobile. The only exception to that is that if you take, for example, cavalry units or motorcycle units, as in infantry units on motorcycles, they count as being as having their own transport already.
Yeah, so important point there. You have to have enough seats for everyone.
Yes.
But they don't have to use them at the start of the battle. You don't have to deploy in them. You just have to have the capacity to carry everyone if you had to.
Yeah, we'll talk about this in a minute when we talk about when you see armoured platoons at events, and especially when you see them being mixed and matched with, generic platoons and theatre selectors. But yeah, you're right. The key point is that there has to be enough seats for every unit in an infantry squad or a tow with the artillery. It's not 1 transport per unit. It's enough seats to transport all of those people.
Yeah. And then the other fun point before we move on to sort of debating the merits competitively, this is one of the rare times that you're allowed to take a captain or major without also having to include a lieutenant or lieutenant if you're British.
Yes.
Which is really nice because, yes, there are a huge amount of points, but at least you're not paying sort of your 50 points for your second lieutenant as well. And so actually, if you were really keen to run a captain or major because you had some sort of fun, maybe you wanted to activate all 3 tanks simultaneously, you could stand them behind it.
Yeah.
It's nice that this is the one time you don't have to pay for the lieutenant.
Yes. Yeah. If you've got some, snap to shenanigans in your head, absolutely, yeah.
Now, competitively, I imagine your complaint, if we were playing single platoon, I imagine your complaint would be that you just can't have enough infantry. 3 squads, is that enough, Phil?
Well, yeah. So, as we know from previous episodes, I do like my infantry. I think it very much will depend on the missions being played and more specifically how a TO, if you're talking about going to an event, how a TO is ruling things like objectives in terms of controlling and contesting. Because normally, in the main rule book, a vehicle can contest but not control an objective. And obviously infantry or artillery or transport units with an infantry inside can can control. So on the one hand, you might look at it and go, you've only got 3 3 infantry units plus all of your artillery and your mortars and snipers and all that kind of stuff. But actually, if you don't really need many infantry units, because you say, for example, that armoured vehicles can control, then only having 3 infantry units doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I think if you go into a tournament where Or if you just decide between you that vehicles aren't going to be able to control or contest objectives, I think the way to do this is to pad out all of those team weapon slots, because they can take objectives. So make sure you've got the mortar, make sure you've got the sniper. Even the machine gun team has merit here because it can run onto an objective.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, if it's single platoon, pad it out if that's the case. But it does, from a kill points perspective, it does make for a very tough list, because you could have big tanks putting out lots of hits. So, for example, you could take sort of 3 Panzerwerfers. So you've got lots of opportunities to roll at 6. They're going to hit hard. And if it's just kill points, equally, the riflemen can't hurt them in return.
Yeah.
And so the tank platoons can build very strong kill points lists, I'd say.
Yes. We mentioned already about this year's WTC and the recent Battle of Britain, both of which allowed tank platoons alongside theatre selectors and alongside generic platoons, I believe. And what you absolutely saw were that the tank platoons were doing or the armoured platoons were doing very, very well because of the ability to take, 3, 4, 5 Dakar Stuarts, or the Panzer IIIs, or the Italian tank with all the machine guns in it. So there's definitely, as a TO, you definitely have to think carefully about what kind of event you want to run. And if you do allow armoured platoons alongside the normal generic platoons, theatre selectors and so on, you're skewing the selections in a certain way. To be fair, that's true. Any list restrictions you put for any event, you're skewing the selections in a certain way. But you're skewing it very clearly if you allow armoured platoons alongside generic reinforced platoons.
Yeah, Bo Mortensen on YouTube recently made a video about that, about saying that basically anytime you make a restriction, all you do is you make something else the most powerful thing, and you've just sort of shifted the meta a little bit.
Absolutely.
So I'll not dwell on that. You could go watch that video if you're interested in that idea. But yes, allowing you to mix armoured with infantry platoons, I think basically allows you to make up for the weaknesses in both. Because your infantry platoons, the problem is, if you allow unlimited platoons, you still have to pay at least a 35-point tax for the officer, who is also an easy kill dice in kill points missions. So if I want 3 Stuarts, let's say, I have to take 3 of those squishy officers for 105 points. However, if you allow me to take a tank platoon to take my 3 Stuarts, I've paid the 25-point upgrade for command, and then I can just build my normal platoon with 5 infantry squads. Perfect. Equally, if you limit me to only armour, it means I have to pay for 6 vehicles if I want more than 3 infantry squads. So, from my perspective, my favourite sort of restrictions are you allow one or the other, but you don't allow them to mix. That's where I think, because otherwise you're allowing people to mitigate the negatives of taking that platoon.
Yeah, what I will say though is because obviously tanks get expensive very quickly. And if you're having to take 3 as a bare minimum, and you realistically you're going to take 4 or 5, I would imagine. If you're doing that at 1,000 points, you can't do that. There's just not enough points to have anything more than 5 dice and 5 armored vehicles. So at 1250, even then the points are pretty tight. If you look at the lists that were taken to the Battle of Britain and WTC, and you mentioned Bo's YouTube channel, and he's done deep dives analysis of the lists for both of those events, where people were taking armoured platoons. They were either having to maybe sacrifice the quality of those infantry. You weren't seeing 3 sort of 8-9 man vet squads, for example, where you saw some, but you didn't see a huge number. Or you were maybe having to go a little bit cheaper on your vehicles in order to have enough points left to have some infantry with staying power. Yeah. It does throw up some interesting some list decisions, effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And I quite like that. I like having to make decisions when you're building a list. Oh, do I sacrifice this for this, vice versa? And that's why I actually don't mind playing tank platoons against infantry platoons, but when you allow people to have 5 infantry in this platoon and then 3 tanks in this one, then you've removed the restriction on the infantry platoon for how much armour they can have, and you've removed the restriction for how much infantry the armour platoon can have, and so it's win-win. I hear your point about like the cost of the tanks is itself a restriction, but actually there are certain builds, like the Stuart isn't hugely expensive. We're talking sort of 140 points.
140 points, yeah.
And so you're looking, what's that? 420 points for 3 of them.
Yeah.
Now, that leaves you a lot of points to play with. That's 830 points at 1250 to build a normal infantry platoon alongside. So for 830 points, I can have quite a lot of Gurkhas, heavy mortar, the 25 pounder, all those fun things. Because, I mean, I'm only 170 points shy of the 1,000. So I could take basically my normal 1,000-point list, knock 30 points off.
Shave a bit. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and shave a bit off and then just add another 2 Stuarts. So
yeah,
that's for me, that's why, and again at the English Open, that's why I was keen that we do, because I do love seeing tank platoons, and I love when the guys get really into the theme. The one that I wanted to do was the Pacific one with the 4 Stuart Satans with the flamethrowers in, led by an M5. It's not super competitive because you got no range really.
Yeah.
And so I love seeing them, but I do think fighting them against other tank platoons is the best way to go from a sort of tournament setting. And I think if you are going to allow a mix of infantry versus tank, that's the best. They're best down the club where you can sort of pre-arrange your games, in my opinion.
Yeah, to be fair, I haven't played a huge amount of Tank Wars, but I absolutely would love, to get my British Airborne out and then have my 30th Corps, and kind of reenact, the Road to Arnhem. Yeah.
Is that the Highway to Hell, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Oh, no. Hell's Highway.
Hell's Highway, well, yeah.
Highway to Hell is AC/DC. So, jump back to the command vehicle rule briefly, if you'd allow, sir. Now, generally, in my mind, it's a lot of points for not much reward, that one, because do you want to keep your tanks within 12 of each other? That's the first point. The second point is, even then, +1 isn't hugely different. And if you're on 3 pins, yes, you'll pass your test, but you're still not going to hit anything because of the pins.
Yeah.
But the French, Soviets, and Japanese have a lovely little rule there where you can take 10 points off, so now it's only a 15-point upgrade, and it limits your range to 6 inches rather than 12, because basically they didn't have radios. They were doing hand signals, shouting at each other, I imagine throwing bits of paper, all that sort of stuff. And so that, if you're doing a Soviet tank platoon, actually, you can save yourself 10 points there, which would be nice.
I was just thinking, it doesn't really help with the French and the Soviets. French and the Japanese, because their tanks aren't great. But if you're playing Soviets with a tank platoon, knocking off that 10 points actually does make sense, because you'll get some decent Soviet tanks anyway.
Especially if you're doing something like a Katyusha platoon, where they don't even benefit from that rule anyway, so it is just attacks. Because they're not armoured. Equally the other way around, though, you can, if you have 3 tanks, if your compulsory 3 are the same tank, and they don't have to be the exact same model, they just have to be from the same unit selector. So the ones like the Stuart, where you can add the options to maybe to have a flamethrower, as long as you've got the same entry, you could, if they're the 3 are the same, for an additional 5 points, you can upgrade your commander to have a radio network, which gives him +1 morale. So that's 30 points upgrade now. It's not a bad one. I mean, in for a penny, in for a pound. If I'm 25 points deep on command, making it +2 might actually be worth it for 5 points. Equally, if you've got 2 armour platoons, you can actually make one of the commanders the company commander for 15 points. So now you are that's basically a 10-point upgrade on the radio network, which is a 25-point upgrade on the tank. So effectively that's a 40-point upgrade. That gives you +3 morale. And then finally, if you've got 3 or more platoons, so now we're talking big battles, we're talking sort of probably 3,000 plus points, I would guess. If you've got 3 platoons, you can make someone the armoured battalion commander. That's 25 points on top of the original. Again, the way it's structured in the book, they just keep adding the points on. But effectively, you pay 25 points for command, you pay an additional 25 points to make him the armoured battalion commander, and then he gives +4 to armoured vehicles in his platoon. Now, I don't see much merit in 50 points for +4 for the reason I've just said. Yes, it's great, because if you've got 4 pins, you're still testing a full morale, but you're not going to hit anything when you pass your test.
Yeah, true, yeah.
So for the 50 points, but I did think of a single use case. There's only one place where I think this would be brilliant, and that's if you did take that Panzerwerfer platoon, or the Stuckerzufus, so you took your artillery platoon, basically, supported by 2 sort of close assault platoons.
Yeah.
That artillery platoon, because they always hit on a 6 anyway, the number of pins they've got on them when they shoot doesn't matter, and you just need them to pass the test. And so actually there, if you had 3 to 5 Panzerwerfer with +4 morale, that's probably pretty good. Equally, though, we're talking about games here, because this is a 3 platoon minimum.
Yeah.
We're talking about games that most of us will play maybe once a year, if that.
It could be one of those great, like club open days or club, open evenings where 3 or 4 of you get together and bring all your toys and just have a massive game of Tank Wars. But yeah, you're not going to see it very often. As you were talking about the Stuka and the Panzerwerfer, I was thinking allies can do it with the priest, for example. Any howitzer, any armoured vehicle with a howitzer, indirect firing on the 6, that is when it doesn't really matter about the pins, providing you pass that order check.
Yeah, absolutely. And with you wanting to shoot every turn to range in, that is pretty good. So really that was just a brief overview for the sake of anyone who's playing this, as you say, in a big club day or a demo game at a show. That's not one we're going to see very often, the battalion commanders or the company commanders. So was there anything else you want to talk about in terms of the selector itself?
Yeah, so it's the transport and tows bit. So this does absolutely need highlighting. So every single infantry unit, every squad, artillery needs a transport or tow. And this allows me to talk about 2 of my favourite units, one of which we've already mentioned on an earlier episode. So what you often will see here is, rather than taking 10 or 12 man transport capacity vehicles to put all your dudes in, you might take, for example, the Bedford, if you're the British, and you upgrade it and it can take 29 men, for example. Or you might, if you're talking about US Marines here, or indeed British, you might bring out your Buffalo.
Yeah.
So you might be looking at this going, crikey, I've got to buy a load of transport vehicles. But actually, bearing in mind what you said earlier, that you just have to have enough seats for the models. You don't actually have to bring them on the table in transport or tows. You can get around it by paying a little bit more for a big, massive transport vehicle. And then you just deploy them on foot when it comes to the actual game itself.
Yeah, the only thing to be careful with that is your artillery. Your artillery will take up the entire transport. So it's very rare. I think there's 1 or 2 transports where the capacity is an artillery piece plus X men.
Yeah.
Generally, the transport capacity is this many men or an artillery piece. And so what you tend to have to do is to buy a tow just for the artillery piece. But fortunately...
And you know what I'm going to say.
I was about to say, fortunately, there is a very cheap tow available, isn't there, Phil?
Absolutely, there is, yeah. So if you so choose, here's where your mules come in.
Yeah, or your horses.
Or your horses, yeah, depending on the size of the artillery piece you're trying to tow. But yeah.
Or there is a tractor as well, which I think that's available to everyone. It's definitely available to the Germans and the Hungarians, because I built one to tow an 88. And so there's a tractor, about 15 points, I think, and the benefit of him is he's wheeled, and he also is 6+ to damage rather than the truly soft-skinned mule, which is a 3+ to damage.
Which is a 3. Is that an actual tractor?
I don't think it's a tractor in what I think you're imagining.
Okay.
And it's not what Farmer John's using out in the field.
That's where I was going, yeah.
No, I think it's an artillery tractor where it's the kind of thing, if you imagine a World War II airfield, it's the kind of thing that would pull a plane.
Okay, yeah, cool.
I think that's what we're talking about here, and that's the model that I've got. I've got a Tamiya one, but it's rather obnoxiously 1/48 scale. And it's huge.
Yeah.
I think it's bigger than like a KV1, KV2.
Fair enough. And that's going to be different to the artillery tractors that you can take, for example, in the US selectors, isn't it?
The tractor that I'm talking about,
Yeah.
I can't remember if it's available generically to everyone, one of those all units or not.
Okay.
Okay. So the tractor is in the armies of Italy and Axis as a Hungarian entry. It's 12 points in experience, 15 regular, 18 points veteran. It's just a soft skin that can tow any artillery piece, basically.
Right, okay.
I thought it was one of those units that have been given to everyone, but I don't think it is. I think it's just a uniquely Hungarian thing.
How bizarre.
So, moving on, in the book, Tank Wars, the next thing after the armoured selector, you've got some lovely examples of platoons in silhouette.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the artwork, to be honest, because it neatly shows you the kind of platoons that you might have seen during the war.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like your HQ sections and your first platoon and artillery platoons, etc. After that, because obviously that's just informative, after that, the next thing in the book for gaming is there is a tank battle scenario. Now, this one is quite interesting. They haven't broken the mold in any way, but what they've done, as far as my reading, is they've taken key positions, which is an objectives mission, and they've basically tweaked it to make it a little bit more interesting to play with tanks. So instead of getting D3 plus 2 objectives, it's D6 objectives.
Yep.
They're placed 6 inches from the edge and 18 from each other. So actually, if you've rolled 6 objectives, they're going to cover most of the board, really.
Yeah.
Which is quite nice, I suppose. It stops you doing sort of an armoured spearhead down just one flank. Once you've set up your objectives, it's a classic roll for sides, choose units, first wave. To control an objective, you just need any of your units within 6 of it. So they've increased the range to capture objectives and also, I believe, changed the capturing restrictions to any unit. So your tanks are now capturing units, which is really nice if you're playing Tank Wars. Now, the other change is in the victory conditions. Let's say I score more at the end of the game. I have 4 objectives, you have 2. I've won. Brilliant. However, if we both have 3, in this specific mission, there's a really nice secondary victory condition where if we have the same number of objectives, and it would normally be a tie, we then compare our kill points, how many order dice we killed of the opponent's force, and if you kill 2 more than your opponent, you win the game. And so actually there's a nice secondary game going on where, yes, you want to get all those objectives, but you need to consider that if you do end up tying, then the kill points are going to matter.
Yeah.
And there's one other thing before we discuss sort of the merits of this generally, is that there's a nice condition added in the book where if you totally destroy your opponent's force, you automatically win. Now, that doesn't seem like it needs to be stated, but actually it's not in the main rule book. And one of the things that I've found happened, it's rare, but occasionally you can play kill points, destroy your entire enemy's force, but if they only had 6 dice to start with and they took 8 of your 12 dice out going down, they still win the game even though they've got nothing left on the table. So I quite like that they'd added that, because it would be a rare scenario, but I could see a case where at the end of the game nobody's on any objective and you've killed less of your opponent, but your opponent has nothing on the table.
Yeah, and to be fair, you do see, don't you, at events, there'll be a line saying if at the start of a turn a player has no units on the table, either because they've been destroyed or they're stuck in reserve and haven't come on yet, they automatically lose the game.
Yeah, it's quite a rare one, to be honest. It's one that I always include in tournament packs, but it's actually not one that I see in other people's packs that often.
Okay.
But I started including it just because I saw that happen where somebody tabled someone, but it ended up being, I can't remember if it was a draw or a win to the player who had nothing left. Which just seemed like the wrong result, basically.
Yeah.
So, that's that scenario. What do you think of the scenario, Phil? Worth a play?
Yeah, I think so. If you're playing two tank platoons against each other, purely because you need to look at how you're controlling and testing objectives, how many infantry units you've got, and so on. No, I think it should, if you set up a specific tank war event, or you're playing a tank war game with your mates at the club or at home, that looks like a good one to do.
Yeah, and I think this could be one we could include in the English Open. I know we haven't released the mission pack yet, but on the Sunday, we will be doing different missions because it is a tank war day. And so I think this one has good potential to be a nice balanced game there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Fantastic. So, moving on from the scenario, the book then goes into what I would describe as campaign mode, where it tells you how to play Tank Wars as a campaign, which is quite fun, to be honest. If you're doing Tank Wars down the club and you've got players who are committing to coming down every week, this could be a lot of fun, because effectively what happens is at the end of the battle, your tank crews gain experience. So, for example, if they kill a 355-point tank, they'll gain 35 experience points, and they get sort of 20 points for just surviving the battle. And then after the game, you as the commander can spend those points to buy skills. And those skills are, for example, you can give your driver quick reflexes, which allows him to do an escape move once per game. And so all these skills are sort of once per game perks, and they effectively represent your tank crew becoming more experienced and acquiring a very specific set of skills. So I think that could be a lot of fun, sort of to build over time. The thing that I find with campaigns is when I've started them in the past, what tends to happen is somebody drops out, somebody joins halfway through, and I think you have to plan that from the outset, that if someone does join halfway through, how many experience points are you going to give them so that they're not on the back foot, those kind of things. But I think that could be a huge amount of fun, especially if you had a big battle map of somewhere like sort of Eastern Europe, where you've got the nice big open plains and stuff, and you have a battle map of control, and then over sort of the course of a few months, you fight this campaign where the tank crews are getting better. Yeah, a lot of fun. And they do have a thing as well where if the tank gets knocked out, because obviously if the tank gets knocked out, you've lost your crew. But actually, if a tank gets knocked out, you can roll a D3, and that many crew survive. So let's say you roll 2, you could save your driver and your gunner because they're the ones who are the most experienced, and then they just get a new commander next battle.
Yeah.
Also, it's -1 for massive damage, so if there's massive damage to your tank, there's a good chance no one survives that. But I think that's quite a nice little campaign set of rules there.
Yeah, definitely. As you're talking, I'm thinking about how it could work at my local club, because it is something a bit different. And, you know, to be fair, if you've been playing bolt action for a while, we've all probably got loads and loads of tanks at home that very rarely get to see, you know, the battlefield. Or if they do, they don't get to see it, you know, with all their mates. So here's an opportunity to bring out, you know, your 3 or 4, you know, armoured vehicles, your Sherman platoon, whatever it is, in a different way to play the game.
100%. A bit of fun there. Obviously, if you are interested in that, go buy the Tank Wars book, read through it in detail, and sort of design a campaign around it. On that note as well, actually, there's lots of other scenarios in this book, but the remaining ones we're not going to talk about in detail because they're all sort of specific to specific campaigns. So, for example, you've got the Hell's Highway mission, and can you think of any other ones that are in there, Phil?
Yeah, so you've got Bastogne, for example.
Nice.
You've got the Battle of Impal, which is one of the very few wars or battles involving Japanese tank platoons. So that's based in Burma. Battle of Berlin, obviously, with the Soviets at the end of the war, and so on. El Alamein, that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's some really interesting scenarios for using your bolt action minis.
Yeah, and as I say, we're not going to talk about them in specific detail, all those different ones, because it would be sort of a 6-hour podcast. And also, I think most of them aren't going to be applicable to your specific campaign you plan to run. But one thing I will note is there's an interesting quirk in the victory points that they've done there, where instead of being order dice for kill points in a lot of these, they've done, I think they call them attrition points, where it's basically you score the number of points that the tank you knocked out is worth.
Yes.
Which is quite fun. And so actually, on that note, one of the units that's in the book later, so this is sort of in the tail end of the book, you have armoured recovery vehicles, ARVs, and what they do is I've never seen them used in a game because I think they're designed for the campaign play, is they're basically tools for knocked out tanks. And so you move your ARV up to the tank, you roll an order test to hook it up. If you pass the order test, it's now attached much like an artillery piece would be towed behind a tractor or something. If you fail your test, it means that the crew weren't able to get hooked up that turn. And then effectively, you can then drag the tank off the battlefield. And if you manage to do that, your opponent doesn't score points for it, which is a nice little, again, it's a good little campaign bit of fun, a campaign special rule. But it's not one, because that's not how we play general bolt action. It's not one that really you need or you see in most games, I'd say.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
But they are quite interesting because you're getting an armoured vehicle for very cheap because effectively they've taken off the main weapon and they've just added sort of defensive weapons like a machine gun, or I think the heaviest weapon I've seen on any of them is a light autocannon. And so you can get sort of a Panther for 128 points, I think it is. It might be slightly more.
Okay.
With just a machine gun on, but it still gets that armor 10 on the front. I don't think, are these generic units, Phil? This is one of the things that I couldn't, because it does say for every 2 armored vehicles you can take one.
Yeah.
But it doesn't specifically say like when you can and when you can't, as far as I can tell. Yeah,
so Tank War, the book itself, was published in 2014, so it's one of the very, very early ones. And if you look at the wording in those early books, like Battleground Europe and Duel in the Sun and so on, it isn't clear, is it, in those early books all the time whether something counts or doesn't count as in a generic platoon. It's the land mattress is a great example of that. The land mattress appears in Battleground Europe, and it's listed as was used by the Allies. But it doesn't actually say in that particular unit entry that magic sentence of can be used in a generic platoon. In the same way, the ARVs, it doesn't mention it.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised, as a TO, I'd be surprised if you rock up to an event and go, here's my generic platoon as an infantry platoon rather than an armoured platoon. Oh, and I've bought an ARV.
Yeah. I think if you do really want to run one, because there's probably thematic reasons why you might want to run one at something like the Welsh Open, you would really have to get the TO's permission beforehand, because as you say, it's just not crystal clear, is it? So always worth getting permission beforehand. Brilliant. Was there anything else of note on the ARVs, or have we sufficiently discussed them?
I think we have sufficiently discussed.
Yeah, I do really like the idea, to be honest, just the idea of using something like a KV-1 just to drag other tanks around.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I think the other thing to talk about in this book, and one of the reasons that I wanted to do the Tank Wars, is most tournaments state that you can't take the aces out of this book.
Yes.
Now, at the English Open, we didn't put that in the pack.
We didn't.
And so, friend of the podcast, Sam, was asking if he'd be allowed to take Whitman in his Tiger, which is very thematic, very cinematic, you might even say.
Yeah, very iconic, yeah.
And because we hadn't put in the pack, because we were aiming to be as open as possible to get as thematic as possible lists. Well, I thought, brilliant, that actually sounds really cool. But I did think we probably need to read through this book just in case there's anything that
seriously imbalances.
Yeah, if there's just something crazy like roll a d6, on a 6 you win the game. Because if there's something in there, obviously we either need to ban that unit or change that rule in some way just so that it's not absurd. I mean, looking through, it is interesting. You are getting some really nice skills with these tank aces, but you are paying such high points that I don't think this is going to imbalance the game. And I think if anyone brings an ace to the Sunday for the Tank Wars, I think it'll just add to the flavour rather than anything else. I think since we've already mentioned him offhand, shall we start by talking about Whitman? Or Wittmann, I imagine he's pronounced.
I would expect so,
yeah. So Michael Wittmann, famous for his Tiger 1, I believe. So he's famous. I think that's where he got his big kill count. sort of 130 tanks, was it?
Yeah, it was the action at Villers-Bocage, in June 1944.
Nice. Do you know the specifics of that engagement at all?
Not the actual specifics, but he basically knocked out a ridiculously large number of British vehicles. So he is in the village, him and a few other of his tank mates, and managed to knock out a huge number of British vehicles. I think his tank got immobilized, and he managed to escape on foot and avoid capture.
Is that the one where he shot the lead tank and the rear tank? So the tanks in the middle of the column.
Yeah, they were stuck. Yeah,
we're just sort of and also I don't think because of the limited visibility, they hadn't worked out where the shots are coming from, and they just quickly descended into chaos.
Yeah,
I think that's the engagement. I might be thinking of another one, but jumping into his rules, so you can have him for the low price of 519 points. But for that, you are getting a veteran Tiger one, so that's armour 10 on the front. And obviously, you've got that super heavy anti-tank gun, which I believe is an 88, isn't it? In the Tiger one?
Yeah, it will be, yeah.
Yeah, and then obviously you've got your coax MMG and your hull-mounted MMG. He's basically a Tiger one, but your legendary crew also give that command boost of +1 to all your friendly units that are within 6. So he's a bit like having a second lieutenant on your back lines as well. Or on your front lines, I suppose, if you're very aggressive. But he also has his own special rules and a very specific set of skills. So his special rules are that whenever he fires from ambush, you can fire the main gun twice, either against the same target or two different targets. Now that is, I know he's a high price, but that's such a nice rule.
It's actually only 45 points in addition. So if you buy a veteran Tiger 1, which is 474 points, to get Vitmans, you're paying 519. So for 45 points, you're getting Fierce Ambush, which is a very good rule. And you're getting 4 of the skills that appear in the Tank War book as well.
I think the thing you're overlooking there, though, Phil, is the fact that the Tiger one is already so expensive compared to something like
these
Sherman.
Are minor details.
Interestingly, it doesn't say that the second obviously the second target, you can't move 2 units at the same time, so the second target could just be something that's randomly stood still, which is really interesting, and it's one that I think in terms of gentlemanly conduct, I'd say you definitely should be highlighting that rule before the battle.
Yes.
Because it would be a bit harsh to catch your opponent out and shoot the Sherman that moved and the Sherman that's static that your opponent thought was safe. But on his special skills, he's a lucky boy. And what that gives him is when your enemy is about to roll on the damage table, the roll isn't made and the vehicle doesn't suffer any further effects. So basically, once per game, you can just stop your opponent rolling on the damage table.
Yeah.
Which is pretty powerful, because that means instead of getting at least one more pin, 50% chance of getting knocked out, potentially, you've just got 1 pin from being hit. So that's a nice rule. Hair Trigger is his other special rule, which is a gunner skill. After you make a run move, the vehicle can still shoot once per game. So that's a pretty fun rule as well. So you could use that at the end of the turn to race up a road, let's say, on a run, 36 inches, shoot something point blank, and then if you don't kill it and it shoots you back at point blank next turn, well, you can just negate the damage on the damage table with your lucky rule, which is cool. And then his third rule is Bloodlust, which sounds scary, even if nothing else. And I now can't find Bloodlust. And this is one of the problems with the book. The skills are in one section, and when they come up under the character, you then have to flick back and forth. Phil, have you got Bloodlust to hand?
Bloodlust, it's not even listed as a skill. It isn't a skill under the skill section.
It isn't, so it's not my fault then.
No.
Let's be absolutely clear. This isn't my inability to read here that's let me down. This is the book itself. So Bloodlust, which is who knows. I guess I'll add it to the description of the podcast if I ever find out. Yep.
Battle Awareness is the last one, which this is very good. So play after both sides have deployed. If both players wish to use this ability, roll off to see who goes first. you may reposition this vehicle up to 12 inches away from its original position, but still abiding by the deployment rules.
Pretty nice, isn't it?
Wow.
You can use that to basically lure your opponent's tank onto, let's say, the right flank.
Yeah.
And then redeploy 12 inches towards the middle, and then you can move 9 inches further to the left, and now the big anti-tank gun you're going to face is totally out of position.
Then you run up, with your 18-inch run. Then you use your hair trigger to avoid getting blown up. Then you stick it on ambush, take out 2 units at the same time. Yeah,
it's pretty good. The thing that I like about the battle awareness skill is, so I don't like once per game special rules, because all that means is there'll be no times per game for me because I'll forget they exist. And then after the game I'll think, that was the perfect opportunity to play that rule and I just completely missed it. But I like battle awareness because it's happening before the game starts, so you're still nice and fresh. You just do it in the same way as like Rangers lead the way. It's very easy to remember because you're doing it straight away, and then you don't have to remember it later in the game. So I like that a lot.
You'd have to write battle awareness down, wouldn't you, Johnny, and have it on your table, a bit like you did last year with Vengeance.
Well, battle awareness, I think I'll be able to remember that one. But the Lucky and Hair Trigger, I'd have to be honest, I think it'd be quite good to make yourself tokens for them, just so you know when you've spent them.
Yeah.
And your opponent can very visibly see when you spent them. Because that's the other thing I don't like about once per game special skills. Your opponent has to remember you've got them, and then also has to remember if you've used it yet. A bit like with Panzerfaust, where I think the nicest way to play is to have a replacement model. I know that's not always possible for a lot of players, and I've done it myself where I haven't replaced the Panzerfaust. But where I can, I always do, because it's just one less thing for us to remember. So that's Wittmann, or Wittmann. He's probably the most famous of the German aces. Was there another German ace you wanted to highlight?
No, there wasn't, to be honest. I was looking to see what the British aces were.
Well, while you have a look through that, I will just mention briefly Carius, who I'm not aware of in terms of the historical figure, but he's got a Jagdtiger, so he's paying 717 points for that fella.
Wow.
But you do get a super heavy anti-tank gun and a single hull-mounted machine gun.
Yeah.
So you don't even get the coax machine gun. But he ignores the first pin marker in the game that it receives. You just simply discard it. That's what the book says.
Okay.
Decisive advance. When it executes a run order, it may fire its main gun. So this one can run and fire its gun every turn. But of course, it's casement mounted. So if it runs, it can't turn. So it's not as powerful as it first appears there compared to a turreted tank. And then its third rule is that because it's got the 128mm Pak 44, it doesn't suffer the -1 penetration for firing over half range. I think that's a universal rule for the 128mm.
Okay.
But it's also, I think the range on it's so...
I was going to say, it's like the entire table anyway.
So, it's a rare one, but it's nice to have anyway. He's got some fun little things. He's got Eagle Eye, so... If the vehicle has line of sight to the attacker, it may react by shooting the attacker with one weapon that has line of sight. That's in retaliation to if it's nominated. So if you decide you're going to shoot my tank, if I can see you, then I can react to you by shooting at you first, which is pretty powerful with your 128mm gun. He's got strict discipline, which is before you give the vehicle an order once per game, you can just get rid of all its pin counters. So that's strict discipline. Adrenaline rush. Actually, let's do Crankhead first. Crankhead gives you one additional turn once per game. So actually, that's the one where if you're going to do that run move and then fire after it, use your Crankhead to do a turn at the end of it once you're in the back lines. Pretty good. And then the final one, Adrenaline rush. After you fire the main gun, you can fire it a second time, but you have to shoot at the same target. But still, 2 shots is brilliant, especially if you miss the first shot. So that's just very quickly the most expensive German ace you can take. So I'd say probably not worth the points, but a lot of fun. So that's the German aces. Are there any other aces for the Allies, Phil, that are worth looking at?
Yeah, so I think it is worth talking about Captain Pierre Belote. I've completely butchered that pronunciation. Apologies to all our French-speaking listeners. So this is a French early war tank captain. So for 314 points, you get a veteran Char B1. So that's the normal turret-mounted light anti-tank gun with coaxial MMG, one forward-facing hull-mounted light howitzer, and one forward-facing hull-mounted MMG. The reason for highlighting this one is it gets the special rule of exceptional commander, which means that the normal one-man turret rule does not apply to this tank, so it's not necessary to make an order test when issuing an advance order if the tank is not pinned.
Nice.
And then you get things like push through, adrenaline rush, strict discipline, and lucky. But yeah, I was highlighting that one because actually, if you take a Char B1 and you don't have that one-man turret rule in play, it does actually make it quite a useful tank. I admit it is quite expensive.
Yeah, I mean, he's slow, but on the other side, he's armoured all round.
Yes.
But he does have gone from the thing that you like about the Lee, where he's got the light anti-tank gun and the light howitzer that can fire at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Alongside a machine gun. So it has a place. I think 314 points probably a bit steep for it, but there's certainly a place for him in a French tank platoon.
Only 20 points more than a veteran Char B normally.
Not bad at all, really. A lot of fun, that one.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I think we've basically capped off the Tank Wars book. Obviously, there's loads more detail in there. For anyone who is planning to run a campaign, I'd strongly recommend picking up the Tank Wars book for those scenarios, for the other aces that are available in there. There's a lot of Sherman aces for the US, as you'd expect. I'd strongly recommend, if you are running a campaign, picking up the book for that. But I think we've covered all we wanted to cover on there. Obviously, there are other armoured platoons in other theatre books.
Yes.
It's become quite a common thing, hasn't it, for them to throw in one or two armoured selectors now.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and they can be very thematic as well. I believe the Hungarians in Fortress Budapest, one of my favourite books. I think we're going to have to do an episode on it soon. In that book, I believe there's a tank platoon that has that rule that you really liked, where you can redeploy after setup, sort of like a Rangers lead the way style. Yeah, and so there are other tank platoons available, but
other tank platoons are available.
It's becoming a catchphrase, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, on that note, having capped off Tank Wars, all there is to say from me is thank you again for listening. Please do visit tabletoptommies.com for all your podcast and merchandise needs. Anything you do purchase from there will go towards supporting the podcast and allowing us to keep making it every week. So if you are enjoying it and you want to support, thank you so much in advance.
You can also support the pod in the usual way by liking, sharing and subscribing.
Thank you for listening. Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.